I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue.
A few minutes later.
The one we're in and others
You're
around
deflecting.
the Gulf
Before we got to Syria, we had Iraq, we had Libya, we had many
countries in
instances.
this neck of the woods were much more involved in the Syrian civil war than my country was.
Well, you're also
so do you want to take some responsibility for that? Do you want to take more refugees here in Qatar? Do you want to take more in the Gulf?
No one is immune to any sort of criticism. But we're talking about the Western countries, the British countries, the British countries.
What did Britain do in Syria?
Douglas is back at putting woke activists in their place. This time, a debate is taking place on the global refugee crisis in Qatar. Yes, Qatar, the country that is not even signed up to the 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention. The irony is absolutely insane. Now let's hear Murray educate the audience in a way only he can.
We need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad. I'm a good person, you're a Nazi. It's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues. There are two virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering. And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that. But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to.
Such as when you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. You seem to conveniently forget that the developed world moved to the developing world without asking permission.
No, I don't.
It seems to me as well that this is a particularly Western-centric viewpoint, and a misleading one at that, because you know as well as I do, and the figures show it, 85% of the world's refugees, in fact, settle in neighboring countries in the Middle East, in Africa and Asia. They do not rush over to Europe.
Sure. You'd make a big mistake if you think I hadn't heard of colonialism.
You don't seem to address it in any way.
And I'd also suggest, by the way, that I don't know how long we're going to go on about colonialism for. I'm happy to do it as long as you like. But let me just...
have to be factful, though. Don't we have to be
But also, don't think, if I may say so, that colonialism was just a Western thing. What was one of the largest and most significant empires in history but the Ottoman Empire? Do we say that Turkey has to do something like the West to deal with this?
That's not the issue. You
brought up colonialism.
You are talking about the Western view that they should stay where they belong.
I'm saying that it seems to me to be much wiser that if you have a very large humanitarian crisis in, for instance, Syria, you try to make sure that people remain in the area. This isn't say all of them, but it is more likely. I absolutely agree they do. I've seen it firsthand.
Look at Turkey, 3.5 million refugees. Look at Lebanon and Jordan per capita.
What I'm suggesting to you is,
in fact, in Lebanon, you've got 1 in every 4 person living in that country is a Syrian refugee.
Absolutely.
So to suggest they're not doing very much is just being misleading, being dishonest.
Believe me, I'm not being misleading. And I said from the outset that I agree with the point that most refugees remain in the area. And I said that I think that that's a good idea. I'm suggesting to you that I think it's better that people, for instance, fleeing Syria, end up in the countries around Syria in order to be able to return to their country than putting them in Norway.
But they will return. You are suggesting that they don't want to return. Who in their right mind, if they had the option,
when did I say that?
And we will hear from a refugee, if they had the option to return, of course they'd want to return.
I didn't say they wouldn't.
They leave everything behind. But you seem to also be oblivious to another important fact that I just want to throw at you before we go to a video clip that I want to show you. It's, what about the moral responsibility, though, of Western countries that have contributed to the destabilization of the region, the meddling, the military interventions, not to mention the arms sales that continue as we speak? What about that?
Do you want me to answer that? Okay, I'll answer that one frankly. Nobody denies, for instance, the disaster of Iraq. But who are the people who intervened most in Syria?
It isn't just Iraq.
Hang on. Let me answer it. Who intervened most in Syria? It wasn't America. It wasn't Britain. It's Iran, Russia. It's, among others, countries, including the one we're in and others around the Gulf here.
Before we got to Syria, we had Iraq, we had Libya, we had many
countries in this neck of the woods were much more involved in the Syrian civil war than my country was.
The activist quickly dismisses Murray's argument, knowing her claims can't compete with his facts and knowledge. She avoids addressing his points, instead throwing baseless assumptions, twisting his words, and getting confrontational to try and prove him wrong rather than finding common ground.
So do you want to take some responsibility for that? Do you want to take more refugees here in Qatar? Do you want to take more in the Gulf?
Well, but we're talking about
I'm glad to hear
the Western countries, the British countries, the British...
What did Britain do in Syria?
We're talking about these governments that you seem to suggest should be immune.
No, when did I suggest that?
Absolved of any responsibility.
When did I suggest that?
I want to get to the other point that you make, and it's an important one, Douglas Murray. You suggest that we need to actually balance between two very important virtues, two important concepts of mercy toward the refugee and justice toward your own citizens. Let's take a quick look at this instance involving refugees.
The activist, in a pathetic attempt to skewer Murray, bombards him with baseless assumptions while twisting his words yet again, clearly making him uncomfortable. This Muslim activist is downright unbearable. She interrogates Douglas Murray relentlessly, questioning him but never allowing him to respond without interruptions.
Do you send anyone for us? We are the Syrians, about 300...
Sir, I give you the number of Malta authority because you are near Malta.
Hello?
Yes.
About 100 children and 100 women and maybe 100 men. Please hurry. Water is coming into it. The boat is going down. We are dying. 300
Yes, you have called Malta. You have called Malta.
Don't throw us. You can run away.
Call Malta. Call Malta.
I have no enough account on the mobile. It will cut. Please. You have my number now. You call me, please.
A very chilling video, though I don't suggest that you respond on behalf of the Coast Guard, the Italian Coast Guard. But again, it's that same issue of shifting the problem to others. And just for a little bit of context, in fact, this boat, which capsized 5 hours after this call, killing quite a few people on board, we heard that there were about 100 women, 100 children on board, that was twice as close to an Italian island as it was to Malta. But again, this idea that, we have to safeguard our values, where does mercy fit in that? Not just mercy, but the obligation, the legal obligations of states towards refugees.
I'd suggest that we all make sure we don't shift responsibility. There is a responsibility to everyone. That would include the state we're standing in now, wouldn't it? It would include all the states in this region. It would include the brother states. It would include the Ummah. It would include everybody. It wouldn't just be the Italians. Now, the Italians, by the way, and let me just finish this point.
That's a valid issue, but let me respond to it. Because you mentioned the states of the region. It's a valid issue. But unlike the European countries, allow me to just make this point, unlike the European countries,
I'll respond to 2 points.
They are not parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So the legal obligations are, well, it's just a fact.
Conveniently, isn't it?
But I'll let you carry on.
But this means that countries that are signatories to the Refugee Convention get more blame and more assumption that they are going to have to hold more of the burden than countries that didn't. And I'm suggesting to you that nobody should be able to absolve themselves from blame. But if you go to Italy now, and I don't know when you were last there, but it is not the case that this is going well in Italy, either for the migrants who are arriving or for the Italian population.
Isn't it because the resources are not being poured into this? Let's face it, the policies are not there, the resources aren't there.
I see these people when they arrive, I follow their stories. It is not the case just that they don't, the local populations in Italy I've been to Lampedusa, I've seen the boats coming in. The local populations are extremely generous. They are extremely kind to the people. Most of the populations in Europe, let's just not have this idea that Europeans are somehow incredibly cold-hearted. Countries in Europe have taken in a lot of people, and they are trying to deal with a very big problem very swiftly.
Douglas Murray relentlessly exposes the activist's hypocritical stance. Her use of a gut-wrenching, tragic video clip is a vile attempt to guilt-trip the audience, clearly disturbing everyone present. She shifts topics to demonize Western countries instead of engaging in a constructive discussion. Her use of innocent refugees' deaths to make a point is simply disgusting.
My question is, since you brought up migration from the developing world, I'd like to ask you this. Every year, the developed world sends about $300 billion of aid to the developing world, but the developing world sends back trillions in debt repayments to the developed world. Now, don't you think that this is the main reason why migrants are moving to Europe? Because money is moving out of the developing world. Wealth is leaving the developing world and moving to the developed world, to build on what Lamont Hill said. Don't you think this is why people are moving to the Western world, to the developed world?
Well, no, I don't. Again, I repeat the fact there are no simple answers. And if it was simply the fact that you could, do a debt default or something and solve the whole migration issue, then that would be great. But it just isn't the case. you think that if for instance, all African countries were allowed to default on debt, that they'd become burgeoning, flourishing societies? You think that the problem across, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa isn't just unbelievable greed and theft by politician after politician? You think that if you just wrote off the debt, that would stop being an issue and everyone would become transparent and clean in their dealings with money? I mean, the problems are much deeper than this. They're much deeper than just a simple solution like that. The late, very distinguished American diplomat Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a wonderful rule he came up with, known as Moynihan's Law, where he said that human rights, claims of human rights violations often happen in exactly inverse proportion to human rights violations. That is, you hear about them in the countries that are most free. And before long, you can end up with the presumption that the most free countries are the ones who are most abusive of human rights. And this happens with the case when we talk about our leaders and the ones... It's all very well. We can talk about the Trump administration. We can talk about the democracies and so on for all we like. We can all make criticisms, and we all should. But, okay,
briefly,
Mr. Putin, what are you going to do about him? What are you going to do about the mullahs in Iran? What are you going to do about the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia? You see, what we end up with is this situation. We go, oh, Mr. Trump. We can all do that. Believe me, I can riff on Trump
again, you're being
all
quite
day.
selective, aren't you?
What are you going to do about the people you can't do anything about? Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to give them a pass? Or are you just going to enjoy beating up on the democracy?
I hate to have to interrupt you. There's something called democracy, though, isn't there?
Murray demolishes the idealistic fantasies of simple solutions to complex issues. He invokes the late, distinguished American diplomat Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who highlighted the grotesque irony known as Moynihan's Law. This law asserts that claims of human rights violations often arise inversely to actual violations, creating a twisted reality where the freest nations are branded as the worst human rights violators, whereas the violations in the most oppressive societies are overlooked due to the fact that anyone who dares raise their voice is ruthlessly silenced.
So I'm going to talk briefly about, my mother's experience as an immigrant, and I want to touch here on something that Mark Lamont Hill said, this power of education and telling people how refugees fit into the wider context of economic development. Here's why I'm very skeptical about that. Because when my mother arrived in the UK and her parents arrived in the UK, people still called them dirty packies. When she had graduated from Oxford University, she was still a brown person who was not seen as a citizen, right? So to what extent can we really sell this idea that being educated or fitting X, Y, and Z criteria is what you need to do as a refugee for people to humanize you? The inherent problem with these people is that they don't humanize you. You can't fulfill your oppressors' criteria so that they see you as human. So how do you humanize people?
Dehumanizing refugees, thank you very much. And with this, let me go to you, Douglas Murray. Because much of your argument, Douglas, seems to be about the us versus them, the fact that, we have our own values, our own Britishness, our own virtues, and they will come to our shores with their values, their traditions. You seem to almost suggest that they come to your countries with a lesser breed of values.
No, I don't think I said that at any point, and that's another time you've tried to put something in my mouth. First of all, I didn't say that. I said that there are challenges because we do know that there are challenges, and let's just be frank about this. I mean, for instance, I've been in the Gulf for the last week or so. I see more burqas in my home city of London than I have seen in the Gulf in recent days, certainly here in Doha. Now, I can't say I'm delighted by the sight of more and more burqas in London. Do I feel any hatred of the people who wear them? Of course not. Of course not. But I can't say I'm elated by it. And definitely there are times I think, what percentage of burqas in this area becomes like not that pleasant for everyone else.
But again, is it all down to burqas? Because again, you're not asking people with other traditions whether they care about the sight of people drinking alcohol or going up in bikinis. Again, it's a very
we could in Britain
Western-centric viewpoint.
I'm not. I have to say, you're going to bark up the wrong tree if you think you're going to persuade a Brit that we should stop drinking alcohol because of people arriving in our country. I mean, that's not going to happen. These things are all a bit of give and take.
That you bring your own traditions that don't quite fit with theirs.
Well,
they don't.
Yeah, there are, as I said, and before we got all confrontational, which you did from the get-go, I said what the problem is here is that these things are all rubbing against each other. And in that situation, you have to work out what things you're willing to give up, which things you're willing to compromise on, and which ones you're not. You're not going to persuade the Brits to massively change their culture, but let me just make the point. Every single society has certain aspects of it it doesn't want to give up. This one will. In Qatar, this one will. Everyone does. So please don't try to make this a kind of bigoted European thing. That would be a very, very dishonest way to... That would be a very dishonest way to represent
Just answer this question
debate.
directly. Which of your values are you most afraid to lose? Which ones are most threatened by
freedom
the
of
arrival
speech.
of refugees?
Freedom of speech. It's the first one. Oh, you think that's not a problem?
I mean...
You think that's not a problem?
But
you think... Sorry, no. Let me pick up on that. It's
what about the
very
values of
easy to
tolerance,
snigger. It's very easy to snigger about this until you've had friends shot in a newspaper office. It's very easy to laugh about that until it's happened to people you know.
Douglas Murray eviscerates the activists' reckless disregard for the very real threats to free speech posed by refugees from cultures hostile to this fundamental right. This isn't fear-mongering, it's a sobering acknowledgement of stark realities. Freedom of speech is under siege, and dismissing this fact is sheer ignorance.
If anything, I'm giving you the chance to tell us, from your perspective, what you find threatening or not about refugees coming to England.
Let me answer that by broadening, if I may. My suggestion would be, if we're to arrive at any kind of common understanding on this, is that we agree that, for instance, where there are people who pretend that everyone who arrives is a terrorist is barking mad, okay? We can agree with that, but don't laugh at people with serious concerns about serious security concerns either. Because,
like what?
Well, because, you know, we had this in 2015 when certain officials in Europe said the likelihood that anyone coming on the boats among the 1.5 million people who arrived in Germany are going to be violent in any way is total, xenophobic fantasy. And everyone laughed until people started letting off bombs, until, like in Ansbach in Germany, they just had a suicide bombing outside a wine bar. And it just stopped being quite so funny. So all I'm saying to you is, you can agree with me that people who say that most people arriving are going to be violent are ridiculous. Yes, but also don't claim it's ridiculous for people to have serious and sincere concerns about what is happening. Because if you do, there's no way anyone's going to...
And Douglas, do you think in the West, this fear of Islam or anything that looks so different to us?
No, I mean, the society I'm from is one of the most pluralistic and diverse societies on earth. You couldn't get a larger range of people of different backgrounds and ethnicities and languages than you have in Britain.
And
which is why, once again, if I may push back against this thing you are pushing, which is that these are sort of uniquely bigoted, unwelcoming societies.
Not at all.
The evidence on this part of the stage would suggest that Britain is not.
It's not actually the first generation. The first generation are often the ones who do want to integrate, and they just want to, at least my experience, you want to keep your head down, go to school, get a job, get going. It is that second generation that has born and grown up and feels a sense of unbelonging because they're not reflected at all in the education, in the history books, in the art, in the culture, and they are demonized. And that's the community we have to be dealing with and recognizing.
Douglas,
and that's the pluralism that none of our societies.
I know you have something to say before I go to Nelufar.
We do have to address that. Every society on earth has difficulty integrating people, okay, from a very different background. Yes. It's always difficult. Again, I don't think we should fall into this idea that Europeans are uniquely bad at it. We've had to do a lot of absorbing very fast, and we've done most of it very damn well. And bits of it haven't gone well, and we've got to address that. But again, we can agree that there is gun violence in America from crazy people who think they need to be armed to walk to the supermarket. And that doesn't mean, well, okay, but that doesn't mean that people in France don't have their own specific security concerns as well. And what I'm urging you to do is, let's not look at this just from an American point of view. In Europe, it is a serious security concern we have now, and we are trying to deal with it, and that shouldn't be laughed at.
Douglas Murray drops a bombshell of truth. Integration is a brutal challenge for any society, but Europeans aren't the villains here. This myth needs to be destroyed. As the female hostess explains, first-generation immigrants work hard to fit in, but the second generation feels alienated and ignored. They're marginalized in education, history, art, and culture. They're unfairly demonized. Douglas agrees to the point by the female hostess, however. He speaks frankly and urges everyone to acknowledge that this is simply an inevitable consequence of the integration of cultures that are arguably polar opposites to each other in so many ways. Yes, America has gun violence, but Europe's facing severe security threats too. France, Germany, the UK, all battling radical extremism and horrific terrorism. Remember the Bataclan massacre in France, the Manchester Arena bombing in the UK? These violent wake-up calls can't be ignored. Despite rapid cultural shifts, Europe has largely succeeded, but dismissing legitimate concerns endangers us all. This is a war for societal cohesion and safety. Ignoring these truths is a betrayal to everyone fighting for a balanced, harmonious society.
And my question is to you, Douglas. So you talked about us serving justice, and do you think it's judicious for these people in Britain, for example, you talked about how Britain is giving aid to these countries in Africa. It's judicious for them to give this much money to these countries, but without even listening to their needs. So this only contributes to the white savior complex that is currently a big issue in
this
Africa.
whole notion of charity as opposed to policy.
Well, there is a saying we have, damned if you do and damned if you don't. If it's the case that if we don't give aid, we'd be accused of not giving aid, and if we do give aid, it's a white savior complex. I mean, we can all give aid better, for sure, and I just gave, in my opening remarks, what I think was a serious suggestion for one very good use of aid, which is to prioritize it in the region and in the neighboring countries of places people are fleeing from. But, I mean, as I say, I would refuse as well to see the multifarious problems that exist in your own home country and sadly across the continent of Africa. I refuse to say that that's, because of foreign aid only. It's so many things have gone wrong there, and you know that better than I do.
Douglas Murray speaks an unvarnished truth. Should Britain aid African countries? Critics cry white savior complex. But let's shred this notion by looking at examples that prove Douglas correct once again. First, dismissing aid as patronizing discredits critical needs. The Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014 was contained through international intervention, saving countless lives. Ignoring such crises equates to savage human neglect. Second, branding aid as unwanted or misdirected, grossly misguided. British aid in Malawi has funded education, skyrocketing literacy rates. Finally, blaming aid for all Africa's ills is a brutal oversimplification. Global poverty stems from corruption, conflict, and poor governance. Let's tackle real issues, not scapegoat vital aid efforts. Douglas rightly exposes the hypocrisy. Critics will demonize Western nations regardless. If it's not for withholding aid, it's for providing aid. These critics will never be satisfied. At the end, debates like this reveal that while people like Douglas strive to spread awareness and tackle vital societal issues, there will always be individuals whose sole aim is to complain and vilify, driven by hatred and a victim mentality. If you support Murray's fearless truth, hit that like button, subscribe for more uncompromising debates, and comment your thoughts below.